I'm Simone, 31 years old, and I still remember the exact moment my stepson served me divorce papers for an inheritance dispute at my own husband's funeral, before the guests had even finished offering their condolences. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever been falsely accused by family right after losing someone you loved. Hit that like button and subscribe. This story is for you. I'm formally contesting my father's estate, Bradley announced, standing in the receiving line at the funeral home, holding a manila envelope out toward me while dozens of mourners still lingered nearby with their heads bowed in grief. You manipulated him into marrying you 3 years ago specifically to access his assets. This ends today. I stood frozen in my black dress, my husband's casket still visible through the open doors behind us, staring at my 34-year-old stepson, a practicing attorney, watching him hand me legal documents over his own father's body before it had even been buried. "Bradley, this isn't the time or place," I said quietly, my voice trembling despite my effort to remain composed. "There's never going to be a convenient time for you," he said, loud enough that several relatives turned to watch. "You knew he was sick. You knew he wouldn't live much longer. 3 years of marriage, and now you expect this family to simply hand over everything he built to someone who was practically a stranger when they met." My mother-in-law, standing nearby, said nothing, simply watching with an expression I couldn't quite read. Somewhere between discomfort and quiet complicity. Nobody stepped forward to defend me. Nobody asked Bradley to wait even a single day before launching a legal battle over his father's grave. I looked down at the envelope in my trembling hands, then back at Bradley's cold, calculated expression, understanding, with a sinking clarity, that he had planned this moment carefully, choosing the funeral specifically because he believed grief would make me too vulnerable, too emotionally shattered, to fight back effectively. They believed a public accusation delivered at my husband's own funeral was enough to break me completely, certain I would simply sign away my rightful inheritance out of exhaustion and grief rather than face a prolonged legal battle. What none of them knew, not Bradley, not my mother-in-law, not a single relative watching this unfold, was that during the final 18 months of my husband's illness, he had recorded every single conversation with his attorney, a habit born from his own worsening memory issues, conversations that documented, in his own voice, exactly what he wanted his estate to become and exactly what he thought of the son now trying to take it from me. I met Walter 3.5 years ago at a community fundraising event back when I was working as a hospice care coordinator, a job that had taught me, over many years, to recognize genuine kindness in people facing difficult circumstances, rather than being swayed by wealth or status. Walter was 62 then, 29 years older than me, recently widowed after losing his first wife to a long illness. Gentle and thoughtful in a way that felt entirely unrelated to the successful commercial real estate business he'd built over decades. Bradley made his opinion of our relationship clear from our very first meeting, treating me with a cold, clinical suspicion that never fully thawed throughout the 3 years Walter and I dated before eventually marrying. He was 31 at the time, already an established attorney specializing in estate law, and I understood, even early on, that his professional expertise made him particularly attuned to viewing any new relationship in his father's life through the lens of asset protection rather than genuine human connection. Walter proposed to me 2 years after we met, and I remember the specific conversation we had beforehand about a prenuptial agreement, one Walter insisted on personally, not because he doubted my intentions, but because he understood, from decades of watching Bradley's own professional world, exactly how quickly family relationships could become contentious around money and inheritance. I signed it without hesitation, relieved, honestly, to have clear boundaries established from the very beginning of our marriage. 18 months into our marriage, Walter was diagnosed with early-onset frontotemporal dementia, a diagnosis that devastated him particularly given his sharp, analytical mind, the same mind that had built a successful business through decades of careful negotiation and strategic planning. As his condition progressed, Walter grew increasingly anxious about ensuring his estate planning remained clear and unambiguous. Worried, he confided in me during one particularly difficult evening about exactly the kind of dispute Bradley would eventually attempt. "I know my son," Walter told me quietly one night, his hands trembling slightly from the medication managing his symptoms. "He sees relationships as transactions to be evaluated, not connections to be trusted. I need to make absolutely certain my wishes are documented so thoroughly that he can't twist them into something unrecognizable after I'm gone." It was around this time that Walter began recording his conversations with his longtime estate attorney, David Ferris, a practice his neurologist had actually recommended to help him retain clarity about important decisions as his memory increasingly failed him. Walter kept these recordings on a small digital device, reviewing them periodically to reassure himself that his intentions remained consistent, a habit that continued steadily over the following 18 months, as his condition gradually worsened. I had no idea, sitting beside him during those quiet evenings as he carefully documented his final wishes, that those recordings, born entirely from his own worsening memory and his neurologist's practical suggestion, would eventually become the single most important piece of evidence standing between me and losing everything Walter had specifically, deliberately wanted me to have. 6 months before Walter passed, his condition had progressed significantly enough that David Ferris began visiting our home directly for their regular estate planning conversations, rather than requiring Walter to travel to his office downtown. I remember those visits clearly, David's patient, careful demeanor as he walked Walter through the same essential points repeatedly, ensuring his client's wishes remained clear and legally unambiguous despite his declining cognitive function. During one particularly significant recorded conversation, roughly 4 months before Walter passed, he explicitly discussed his concerns about Bradley directly with David, concerns I hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying so heavily. "I love my son," Walter said during that recording, his voice carrying the particular clarity that came during his better days, "but I've watched him build his entire career around finding loopholes and technicalities in other people's estate plans. I need you to make absolutely certain there are none in mine." David had assured him, during that same conversation, that the estate documents were airtight, structured specifically to leave the majority of Walter's assets to me, with Bradley receiving a modest but respectable inheritance, along with several specific personal items Walter wanted him to have, chosen carefully to reflect their complicated but genuine father-son relationship despite Bradley's suspicious treatment of me throughout our marriage. What I didn't fully understand at the time, though I would piece it together much later after Bradley's funeral confrontation, was that Bradley had grown increasingly concerned during those same months about his father's declining health, not out of primary concern for Walter's well-being, but specifically regarding what he perceived as my growing influence over estate decisions during a period when Walter's cognitive capacity was actively being questioned by his own family. 3 weeks before Walter passed, Bradley had privately consulted with a colleague at his own law firm, exploring, according to messages I would only discover much later during the legal proceedings that followed, potential grounds to challenge his father's estate plan based on claims of diminished capacity, specifically timing this exploration around the period when Walter's dementia diagnosis had become more broadly known within the family. I didn't know, sitting beside Walter's hospital bed during his final week, holding his hand as he drifted in and out of consciousness, that Bradley had already begun quietly building a legal case designed to challenge the very estate plan his father had spent 18 months carefully, deliberately documenting, specifically anticipating exactly this kind of challenge. Standing at that funeral home, watching Bradley hand me divorce and inheritance contest papers over his own father's casket, I didn't yet understand the full scope of what he had been constructing behind the scenes for weeks. All I understood was that my husband's own son had chosen his father's funeral specifically to launch a legal attack, believing, correctly, that grief would make me vulnerable, but incorrectly assuming I had no meaningful evidence to counter his claims. My sister, Danielle, a paralegal who had helped me navigate countless difficult moments throughout Walter's illness, met me outside the funeral home within minutes of Bradley's confrontation, her expression shifting from grief to sharp, protective focus the moment she saw the papers in my shaking hands. "Simone, don't sign anything," she said firmly, "and I need you to think carefully. Did Walter ever mention keeping any kind of documentation about his estate wishes, beyond just the formal legal paperwork?" I thought immediately of the small digital recorder Walter had kept in his nightstand drawer, still sitting there, untouched, in the home we'd shared together. Danielle drove me home from the funeral home that same evening, both of us still dressed in our black funeral clothes, moving quietly through Walter's house that suddenly felt considerably emptier than it had that morning. I retrieved the small digital recorder from his nightstand drawer, my hand still trembling as I held the device that contained, I hoped, exactly the documentation Danielle believed we might need. "Let's not listen to everything tonight," Danielle said gently, recognizing the exhaustion and grief still overwhelming me. "But I do want to confirm the device actually works, and that there's meaningful content on it, before we contact David Ferris directly tomorrow morning." We found dozens of recorded conversations spanning the final 18 months of Walter's life, carefully labeled by date in his own increasingly shaky handwriting on small sticky notes attached to a notebook beside the recorder. Danielle helped me identify several recordings specifically dated around estate planning discussions with David, setting aside the most recent and clearly relevant conversations for our attorney's review the following morning. David Ferris arrived at my house early the next day, his expression carrying the particular gravity of someone who had represented Walter for over 15 years and clearly felt the weight of his client's passing personally. I explained what had happened at the funeral home, watching David's expression shift from grief into focused, professional concern as I described Bradley's confrontation. "I need to be direct with you, Simone," David said, settling into the chair across from me. "I anticipated this possibility, which is precisely why Walter and I worked so carefully over these past 18 months to ensure his wishes were documented beyond simple legal paperwork. Do you have those recordings available?" I handed him the small device, along with the notebook cataloging each conversation, watching him review the dates carefully before selecting several specific recordings for immediate playback. We listened together, David occasionally pausing to add context about the specific legal discussions being documented, Walter's voice filling the quiet room with a clarity that felt both comforting and painfully bittersweet to hear again, so soon after his passing. One recording, dated roughly 4 months before Walter's death, proved particularly significant. In it, Walter explicitly discussed his awareness of his own declining cognitive function, his specific concerns about Bradley potentially challenging his estate plan based on diminished capacity claims, and his deliberate decision to have David document this exact conversation specifically to preemptively address such concerns. "I understand my memory isn't what it used to be," Walter's recorded voice said clearly, "But I want this recording to reflect, unambiguously, that I am fully aware of my estate's structure, fully support the decisions we've made together, and specifically anticipate that my son may attempt to challenge this plan after I'm gone. I want it clearly documented that I considered this possibility carefully, with full cognitive awareness, and rejected any modification to protect Simone's rightful inheritance." David paused the recording, looking at me with a quiet, steady confidence. "Simone, this is about as strong a piece of contemporaneous evidence as I've encountered in 15 years of estate law practice." Walter specifically anticipated this exact challenge, documented his full cognitive awareness at the time, and explicitly addressed his wishes regarding Bradley's potential objections. "This isn't just helpful for your case. This could be decisive." David spent the following days carefully organizing the recorded evidence alongside Walter's formal estate documentation, working with a forensic audio specialist to authenticate the recordings and establish clear, unambiguous timestamps that would hold up under the scrutiny of formal legal proceedings. Bradley's legal team will likely challenge the recording's admissibility initially, David explained during our second meeting. "We need every technical detail properly documented before this goes anywhere near a courtroom." The forensic specialist, a meticulous woman named Dr. Patricia Yuen who had testified in numerous contested estate cases, confirmed within days that the recordings showed no signs of tampering or editing, their metadata consistent with continuous recording sessions, matching the dates handwritten in Walter's own notebook. "These recordings are remarkably clean from an authentication standpoint," she told us during a joint call. "The consistency between the handwritten dates, the device's internal timestamps, and the conversational content itself creates a compelling, verifiable timeline." Danielle, working alongside David's legal team, also helped compile additional supporting documentation, including Walter's complete medical records establishing the specific timeline of his cognitive assessment scores throughout his illness, records that showed, notably, that his formal capacity evaluations remained consistently strong during the exact period when the most critical estate planning recordings had been made. "This addresses Bradley's most likely legal argument directly," David explained, reviewing the medical timeline alongside the recording dates. "If he claims diminished capacity invalidated the estate plan, we have contemporaneous medical evidence showing Walter's cognitive assessments remained within normal parameters during the specific conversations where he documented his wishes so thoroughly." Meanwhile, Bradley's legal filing arrived formally within the week, a comprehensive challenge to the estate plan citing exactly the diminished capacity argument David had anticipated, along with additional claims suggesting I had exercised undue influence over Walter during his declining health, characterizing our marriage itself as fundamentally exploitative rather than genuine. Reading through Bradley's formal complaint, I felt a fresh wave of grief and anger, understanding the extent to which he had constructed an entirely false narrative of our marriage, one that erased 3 years of genuine partnership and reduced Walter's own careful, deliberate estate planning into something manipulated and coerced. "I want you to understand something clearly," David told me during our final preparation meeting before the formal hearing was scheduled. "Bradley's complaint relies heavily on the assumption that Walter's declining health made him vulnerable to manipulation, and that you exploited that vulnerability. What we have directly contradicts that narrative through Walter's own voice, recorded specifically and deliberately to prevent exactly this kind of challenge." I thought of Walter during those final months, his careful, deliberate insistence on documenting his wishes so thoroughly, his quiet awareness of exactly what his son might attempt after his passing. He knew this was coming, I said quietly. He spent his final year of clarity specifically protecting me from what Bradley is doing right now. David nodded, gathering the final documentation for the upcoming hearing, which means, Simone, we're not simply defending your inheritance in that courtroom. We're honoring exactly what Walter spent his final months carefully, deliberately trying to ensure would happen. David insisted we approach the weeks before the formal hearing with careful, methodical preparation, treating the case with the same rigor he'd applied to countless contested estate disputes throughout his career. We won't be presenting all our evidence immediately, he explained during one of our final strategy sessions. Bradley's legal team will likely attempt to discredit the recording's relevance before we've had the opportunity to establish their full context and authentication. We need to structure our presentation carefully, allowing the strength of Walter's own documented intentions to build methodically rather than presenting everything at once. It took considerable emotional restraint to continue moving through daily life normally during those weeks, attending grief support meetings, managing Walter's remaining affairs, all while carrying the weight of an active legal battle against my own Stepson. But the same patient discipline that had guided me through years of hospice care work, understanding that difficult processes often require careful pacing rather than rushed resolution, told me David's methodical approach was the right path forward. "What do you need from me?" I asked David during our final preparation session. "Continue exactly as you have been," he said. "Process your grief authentically. Don't engage directly with Bradley or his legal team outside formal proceedings. Let their case proceed based on the assumptions they've built, without any indication of exactly how thoroughly Walter documented his true intentions." He organized the final evidence folder carefully, including the authenticated recordings, Dr. Ewan's forensic analysis, and Walter's complete medical timeline. "We're not walking into that hearing to publicly humiliate Bradley for his grief-stricken confrontation at the funeral. We're walking in to present documented, authenticated truth that speaks for itself." During this preparation period, David also reached out to Walter's longtime physician, Dr. Marcus Chen, who had overseen his dementia care throughout the illness, requesting formal testimony regarding Walter's cognitive assessment history and his professional opinion regarding the recorded conversations' timing relative to Walter's documented capacity evaluations. "I'm prepared to testify clearly regarding Walter's cognitive status during the specific period these recordings were made," Dr. Chen told us during our preparation call. His assessment scores throughout that 18-month period, while showing gradual decline consistent with his diagnosis, remained well within the range indicating full legal capacity to make significant decisions, particularly during the specific months these recordings document. David, reviewing this additional professional testimony alongside our existing evidence, allowed himself a measured, quiet confidence during our final meeting before the hearing. "Simone, we're not simply presenting recordings and medical records in isolation anymore. We have Walter's own explicit, contemporaneous documentation of his wishes, authenticated forensic analysis confirming the recording's integrity, complete medical evidence establishing his cognitive capacity throughout the relevant period, and now professional medical testimony directly addressing exactly the diminished capacity argument Bradley's entire case depends upon." The morning of the formal hearing arrived with a quiet, deliberate resolve settling over me, considerably different from the raw devastation I'd felt standing at Walter's funeral weeks earlier. I dressed carefully, understanding that whatever unfolded in that courtroom would ultimately honor exactly what Walter had spent his final year of clarity so carefully, deliberately trying to protect. "We're not there to attack Bradley's grief or his relationship with his father," David reminded me gently as we gathered our materials one final time. "We're there to ensure Walter's own carefully documented voice finally gets heard clearly, exactly as he intended." The probate courtroom felt formal and understated, wood-paneled walls and modest lighting standing in quiet contrast to the emotional weight of the proceedings about to unfold. David and I arrived early, taking our seats at the respondents' table as Bradley entered separately with his own legal team. Dressed sharply in a tailored suit, carrying himself with the same confident, calculated authority I remembered from his funeral confrontation weeks earlier. Judge Eleanor Ramsey, a measured, experienced jurist who had clearly presided over countless contested estate proceedings, called the hearing to order, reviewing the formal filings before inviting Bradley's legal team to present their case first. Bradley's attorney, a sharp-featured man named Preston Vance, opened confidently, walking the court through their claim of diminished capacity and undue influence, painting a careful narrative of a vulnerable, declining man manipulated by a much younger wife during his final, cognitively compromised months. "Your Honor," Vance stated, "the medical records clearly establish Walter Ashford's progressive dementia diagnosis. Any estate planning decisions made during this period must be viewed with appropriate scrutiny regarding his capacity to fully understand and consent to significant asset transfers." Judge Ramsey listened carefully, occasionally reviewing the medical documentation Vance presented, before turning toward David. "Mr. Ferris, I understand you have additional evidence relevant to addressing these specific concerns." David rose calmly, requesting formal recognition to present both the authenticated audio recordings and Dr. Chen's professional testimony regarding Walter's cognitive capacity throughout the relevant period. "Your Honor, I'd like to begin by playing a specific recording, dated 4 months before Mr. Ashford's passing, in which he directly and explicitly addresses exactly the concerns being raised in this courtroom today." The room fell silent as David played the recording, Walter's voice filling the courtroom with a clarity that visibly affected everyone present, including, I noticed, a flicker of genuine emotion crossing Bradley's otherwise composed expression as he heard his father's voice again for the first time since the funeral. "I understand my memory isn't what it used to be," Walter's recorded voice stated clearly, "but I want this recording to reflect, unambiguously, that I am fully aware of my estate's structure, fully support the decisions we've made together, and specifically anticipate that my son may attempt to challenge this plan after I'm gone." Judge Ramsey's expression sharpened with focused attention as the recording continued, Walter's voice methodically addressing his awareness of his own condition, his explicit support for his estate plan, and his direct anticipation of exactly the challenge currently unfolding in her courtroom. When the recording concluded, David called Dr. Chen to the stand, who testified clearly regarding Walter's cognitive assessment scores during the specific period the recording was made, establishing definitively that his formal capacity evaluations remained well within normal range throughout the months documenting his estate wishes. Preston Vance rose to cross-examine, attempting to challenge the recording's relevance and Dr. Chen's assessment methodology, but his questions grew increasingly strained as Dr. Chen calmly, professionally addressed each concern with detailed medical documentation supporting his testimony. Bradley sat rigidly at the petitioner's table throughout this presentation, his earlier confident composure visibly cracking, as his father's own carefully documented voice systematically dismantled the foundation of his entire legal challenge. Judge Ramsey allowed a brief recess following Dr. Chen's testimony, and when proceedings resumed, she addressed the courtroom with the measured, deliberate authority of someone who had clearly reached significant conclusions about the case before her. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I've reviewed the medical documentation, listened carefully to the authenticated recording, and heard direct testimony from Mr. Ashford's treating physician. Based on everything presented today, I'm having considerable difficulty understanding how your diminished capacity argument can be sustained given this evidence." Vance glanced toward Bradley before responding carefully. "Your Honor, we maintain that the cumulative pattern of Mr. Ashford's declining health, combined with the significant age difference and relatively brief duration of the marriage, warrants continued scrutiny of the estate plan regardless of this specific recording." "With respect," David interjected, rising once more, "I'd like to address that specific argument directly." He turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I have additional recordings, spanning the full 18 months of Mr. Ashford's estate planning process, all consistently reflecting the same clear intentions documented in the recording you've already heard. I'd also like to enter into evidence Mr. Ashford's own explanation, recorded 3 months before his passing, regarding exactly why he chose to document his wishes so thoroughly." Judge Ramsey nodded, and David played a second recording, this one capturing Walter discussing, with remarkable clarity and self-awareness, his complicated relationship with his son, his genuine love for Bradley despite their differences, and his specific concerns about exactly the kind of legal challenge now unfolding. "Bradley has never fully trusted anyone who enters my life without a prenuptial agreement or some formal legal protection," Walter's recorded voice explained. "I understand why, given his profession, but I need it clearly documented that Simone and I did execute a prenuptial agreement early in our relationship, one that actually protected her interests less than what I'm now choosing to leave her voluntarily, specifically because our marriage became something genuine that I want reflected honestly in how I've structured my final wishes." The courtroom fell into a profound silence following this recording. Bradley's composed expression finally broke entirely, his eyes welling with tears he seemed to be fighting desperately to control. He turned briefly toward me, something complicated and raw crossing his face, before looking back toward the judge. "Your Honor," Bradley said suddenly, rising from his seat despite Vance's hand gesturing for him to remain seated, "may I address the court directly?" Judge Ramsey nodded, watching him carefully. "I need to withdraw this challenge," Bradley said, his voice unsteady. "I've been listening to my father's voice for the past 20 minutes, hearing him explain, in his own words, exactly what I refused to believe was possible. I convinced myself Simone had manipulated him because it was easier than accepting that he'd genuinely built a life with someone I never gave a fair chance." He paused, visibly struggling to maintain composure. "I filed this because I couldn't process losing him, and I directed that grief into anger at the person he chose to spend his final years with, instead of actually listening to what he clearly, repeatedly tried to tell me himself." Judge Ramsey allowed a moment of silence following Bradley's unexpected admission, the courtroom carrying a weight considerably different from the adversarial tension that had defined the proceedings just minutes earlier. "Mr. Ashford," she said carefully, "formal withdrawal of your petition requires specific documentation. I'll ask your attorney to prepare the appropriate filing, but I want to note for the record that this court finds Mr. Walter Ashford's estate plan fully valid, executed with clear cognitive capacity, and consistent with his repeatedly, explicitly documented wishes." Vance leaned over to speak quietly with Bradley, though it was clear from his expression that he understood his client's decision was final. regardless of any professional reservations about how the case might have otherwise proceeded. Bradley nodded firmly, dismissing whatever counsel Vance was offering, his attention remaining fixed on me across the courtroom. "Simone," he said, his voice still carrying visible emotion, "I owe you a considerably more meaningful apology than what I can offer here. I served you legal papers at my own father's funeral. I built an entire narrative about our marriage that erased 3 years of what was clearly genuine partnership, because acknowledging that felt like losing him twice." I sat with his words for a long moment, feeling the complicated weight of grief, vindication, and something unexpectedly close to compassion for a man who had, however cruelly, been navigating his own devastating loss throughout this entire ordeal. "I understand grief makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise do," I said carefully. "But Bradley, what you did at that funeral, and what you've put me through these past several weeks, caused real harm. An apology matters, but it doesn't erase that." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm asking whether there's any possibility of rebuilding something, eventually, once I've actually processed everything my father was trying to tell me." David gathered our remaining documentation as the hearing formally concluded, Judge Ramsey confirming the estate plan's validity and dismissing Bradley's petition entirely, with the court record reflecting his voluntary withdrawal, rather than requiring further adversarial proceedings. Outside the courthouse, standing in the cool afternoon air, I felt an exhausted, complicated relief settle over me, understanding that Walter's careful, deliberate protection had ultimately succeeded exactly as he'd intended, even as I grieved the fact that it had been necessary at all. David approached me quietly as Bradley and his attorney departed separately. "Simone, I want you to understand something clearly. What Walter did, documenting his wishes so thoroughly during his final months of clarity, wasn't simply smart estate planning. It was an act of profound love and protection, anticipating exactly the pain you'd face and working deliberately to shield you from it, even after he was gone." I thought of Walter during those quiet evening recordings, his patient, deliberate insistence on documenting every detail, his awareness, even as his own memory failed him, of exactly what his son might attempt once he was no longer there to defend me himself. "He knew Bradley better than Bradley knew himself," I said quietly, watching my Stepson's car pull away from the courthouse parking lot. "And he loved both of us enough to try protecting us from exactly this outcome, even if he couldn't ultimately prevent it entirely." The estate formally settled within 6 weeks of the hearing, exactly as Walter had originally structured it, with the majority of his assets transferring to me, while Bradley received the modest but meaningful inheritance and specific personal items his father had carefully designated for him, chosen deliberately to reflect their complicated but genuine relationship. Bradley reached out to me again roughly 2 months after the hearing, requesting a private meeting rather than continuing our interactions exclusively through legal correspondence. We met at a quiet coffee shop, both of us considerably more composed than during our courtroom encounter, navigating the strange, uncertain territory of two people connected permanently by grief and legal conflict, uncertain what kind of relationship, if any, might still be possible between us. "I've been listening to more of the recordings," Bradley told me during that meeting, his voice carrying a quiet vulnerability I hadn't witnessed from him before. David shared copies with me once the case concluded. "I've heard my father talk about you in ways I never allowed myself to actually witness while he was alive, too consumed by my own suspicion to see what was genuinely happening in front of me. I listened carefully, understanding that whatever reconciliation might eventually be possible between us would require considerably more time and honest conversation, than a single coffee meeting could provide. I'd like to try building something different between us, I said honestly. Not because I've forgotten what happened at the funeral, but because I think your father would have wanted us to eventually find some way toward genuine understanding, rather than permanent estrangement. Over the following year, Bradley and I built a careful, gradually strengthening relationship, meeting regularly, working through the complicated grief and mistrust that had defined our initial years of acquaintance. He eventually apologized more fully, not just for the funeral confrontation, but for years of quiet suspicion and coldness that had prevented him from ever genuinely getting to know me during his father's lifetime. I used a portion of Walter's estate to establish a small foundation supporting dementia research and caregiver support programs, honoring both his memory and the particular, painful journey we'd navigated together during his illness. Bradley, surprising me considerably, asked to become involved with the foundation's work, eventually serving on its board, finding, I believe, a meaningful way to process his grief through genuine contribution rather than continued conflict. David remained a close friend and advisor in the years following the hearing, occasionally reflecting with quiet satisfaction on how thoroughly Walter's careful planning had ultimately protected exactly what he'd intended, despite his own declining health during those final documented months. I think about those quiet evening recordings sometimes, Walter's patient, deliberate voice documenting his wishes with such careful precision, understanding now, with considerable distance from that devastating funeral confrontation, that his love for both Bradley and me had ultimately proven strong enough to protect us from permanent estrangement, even through the painful legal battle that initially seemed destined to divide us forever. 2 years have passed since Bradley served me divorce and inheritance contest papers over his own father's casket, a moment that once felt like the absolute lowest point of my life, now transformed, through considerable time and difficult, honest work, into the beginning of an unexpected but genuine relationship with my stepson. The Ashford Foundation for Dementia Care now funds research at 3 major universities and provides direct support services to over 200 families navigating similar diagnoses to Walter's, a legacy I believe honors both his memory and the particular vulnerability he faced during his final years with such thoughtful, deliberate courage. Bradley serves as the Foundation's vice chair now, having found, through this work, a way to channel his complicated grief into something genuinely meaningful, rather than continued legal conflict. We have dinner together monthly, conversations that have gradually deepened from careful, formal politeness into something closer to authentic family connection, built slowly through consistent effort rather than any single dramatic reconciliation. David remains my close friend and trusted advisor, occasionally joking that our case remains one of the most emotionally significant he's handled throughout his career, precisely because it ultimately resulted not just in legal vindication, but in genuine healing between 2 people who had initially seemed destined for permanent estrangement. I think about that funeral home moment less often now than I once did, though when I do, it arrives with something closer to complicated gratitude than lingering pain. Walter's careful, deliberate documentation of his final wishes taught me something profound about love that extends beyond simple protection of assets. The recognition that genuine love sometimes requires anticipating pain you cannot fully prevent, while still doing everything possible to shield the people you care about from its worst consequences. I am not the woman that funeral confrontation once tried to define as a manipulative outsider undeserving of her husband's trust. I never was. I was simply someone who built a genuine, if brief, partnership with a man who saw and valued me clearly, and who loved his complicated son enough to eventually help heal the very rift his own careful protection had initially, painfully created. Walter's voice, recorded so deliberately during those final months of clarity, ultimately protected not just my inheritance, but something considerably more valuable. The possibility of genuine family connection surviving, even the most devastating initial betrayal, given enough time, honesty, and shared commitment to understanding each other beyond grief and suspicion. If you've ever been falsely accused by family during your most vulnerable moment, only to find truth and reconciliation on the other side, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this journey meant something to you, don't forget to like and subscribe.